Science fiction has always terrified us, and it has invented thousands of monsters to chill us to the bone. Big, lumbering, dirty men in latex chasing screaming women. And the most famous monster of them all is British, from the tip of his big boots to the top of his flat head. Here he comes, Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein was the first science fiction story ever told. It was written by British single mum Mary Shelley over 150 years ago. She told a bloody and nasty tale about a monster brought to life by a bolt of lightning.
We're about to unfold the story of Frankenstein. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you.
Frankenstein is the original science fiction story, the chilling tale of a maverick scientist who builds a monster out of some second-hand body parts. Not surprisingly, this experiment in human meccano all goes horribly wrong.
It's alive. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Today, everyone knows Frankenstein's monster, the bolt through the neck, the scar, the funny walk. But that's not because of the book, it's because Frankenstein went to Hollywood.
This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions.
The reason we all know Frankenstein now is not the novel. It's because in 1931, Universal Pictures made a movie, the movie we all still think of as Frankenstein.
Frankenstein really just takes the guts of the novel and actually creates all the icons itself. The look of the monster, the hunchback assistant, the spinning, buzzing things, that's all from the film.
And this classic film was directed by a Brummie called James Whale. James Whale was a gay British director who is now forgotten, but whose images of the monster are still with us. Because he was gay, Whale had a daring take on this fearsome sci-fi theme.
I think the fact that James Whale was gay makes him quite sympathetic to the monster, especially being gay in his 20s and 30s when things weren't liberated as they are now. He really knew what it was like to be an outsider. And I think deep down, he really loved that big beast.
Whale was gay at the time when it was outlawed. It was against common decency, against nature. gay men were considered to be perverted monsters. This was how Whale learned what it was like to be an outsider.
It's probably not coincidental that James Whale, the director of the Universal Frankenstein movies in the 30s, was not only from England, but also gay. And I'm sure some parts of a gay experience in the 1930s must have had something to do with making the other and the different something which is valuable and interesting and not necessarily to be an object of fear and absolute rejection.
Oh, I thought I was alone.
Watching Frankenstein now, you can enjoy hunting out all the really gay bits where James Whale's style becomes flamboyant, over the top, and utterly camp.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
Here, the two scientists are lording it over their creation, a Joan Collins lookalike.
Certainly he has a very early instance of what we later came to think of as camp humor. That kind of eccentricity is there.
James Whale, a gay working-class brummie, was quite the outsider, and so was his creation. Whale sympathised with his monster's torment and his disastrous attempt to hold a barbecue.
Frankenstein was a groundbreaking movie, of course it was.
Frankenstein.
The misfit, the mutant X-Men, the plea for sympathy, for the unusual. This guy's wandering around with a bolt through his neck. You shouldn't hate him, you should try and understand him. Mind you, if you don't try and understand him, you've got a problem.
I love dead. Hate living.
It's a film where we're all on the side of the monster, like King Kong the same year. Nobody ever likes those guys with the biplanes.
One of Whale's most eccentric and camp additions to the story was Dr. Pretorius, who seduces Henry Frankenstein into creating a mate for his monster.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Pretorius also plays God. He knocks out a job lot of little people, but remains frustrated by their size.
There's an extraordinary scene, a famous scene where Pretorius has the things in a jar.
Very bizarre, this little chap. There's a certain resemblance to me, don't you think? Or do I flatter myself?
It has a certain resemblance to me, don't you think? Or do I flatter myself?
I, my dear pupil, went for my material to the source of life. I grew my creatures, grew them as nature does, from seed.
And he actually says, I grew mine from seed. And you go, ooh.
Whether Pretorius' seed was something he picked up at the garden centre or spilt himself is mercifully unclear. But it's crystal clear that this is the story of two men having a baby without the inconvenience of a woman.
Somehow it got through the censors. I don't quite know how, but it's a kind of mad, gay utopia. Because it's actually about procreation without women.
Neither his sexuality nor his artistic talent prevented the young James Whale from enlisting to fight in the First World War, an experience which scarred him and the films he went on to make.
The look of the film is very much informed by the cinematic vision of World War I. All the landscapes are full of mud, yeah, everything's blasted, and just the use of scars as a recurrent image in 1930s horror films seems to me to be the result of, yeah, a generation's experience of war.
The First World War was the first truly technological war. In the trenches, Whale experienced the destructive power of all its horrific machines, the artillery, the mustard gas, and these unprecedented scenes of techno-carnage influenced the main theme of Frankenstein, the misappliance of science. The film anticipates the horrors inflicted by technology in the 20th century. Its scenes of human experimentation predict the nightmares to come. Whale left the army to become an actor, appearing in such plays as The Knights of the Burning Pestle. But the megaphone was calling. He took up directing and was offered a schlocky horror film. He brought to it the distinctive take of his sexuality and his First World War experience. And so this piece of pulp became a work of genius.
You have a pulp factory or any kind of factory. If you've got an artist working there, like Whale, and he's given the freedom to do what he wants with the material, then almost despite themselves, and to this day it's true of Hollywood, I think, almost despite themselves they'll come up with something great. And they probably won't know it for about another 20 years, having shelved it and tried to tear it to pieces. But that's how good Hollywood films get made. You know.
Next up on SF UK, the single mother who gives birth to the monster, while Frankenstein himself gets hammered. The beauty of the beast, the way that we all feel sorry for the monster instead of just hating him, wasn't all Whale's handiwork. Beneath the makeup was the remarkable actor Boris Karloff.
The real reason we remember the movie is Boris Karloff's performance as the Frankenstein monster. Not just the brilliance of the performance, and it's still a remarkable piece of acting, but the brilliance of the makeup job, the flat head, the bolt through the neck, the scar, those Karloff-type eyes, the big lumbering body, the huge boots. That's still our image. 70 years on, that's what we think of as the Frankenstein monster.
Karloff was another English element of this science fiction landmark. His real name was William Henry Pratt. He was an English gent, educated at Enfield Grammar School and King's College, Cambridge. Before arriving in Hollywood, he'd been a farmhand and a truck driver, but Frankenstein made him a star.
He acts brilliantly with his eyes. You see these great, shining, tear-filled, painful... I mean, he's in terrible pain because of the bad working conditions at Universal Studios. He was one of the founders of the Screen Actors Guild, because playing the Frankenstein monster probably crippled him for life.
It's the subtlety of it. His is the extraordinary performance, you know. And it's so many details. It's things like when he backs into the room and Frankenstein opens the shutters, I think, and he just captures the light like butterflies.
The monster escapes into the community.
Will you play with me?
He meets a little girl, and he looks like he's about to reveal himself as the most hated monster of them all, a paedophile.
You have those, and I'll have these.
This bit was missing from the film on its release.
I can make a boat.
The studio cut it.
See how mine floats?
Not because they thought killing a child was too shocking, but because the scene makes the monster too sympathetic. He doesn't mean it. He just plays a little rough.
No, you're hurting me! No!
The scene ended up on the cutting room floor, and so the studio made the monster look like a deliberate child murderer. They made him easier to hate. They made him into a scapegoat.
Those scenes that always come at the end, where you get the mob of torch-bearing villagers chasing the monster and then burning the mill down or stringing him up. I mean, it looks like a clan meeting, doesn't it? It looks like a lynch mob.
Whale's vision of the monster as the ultimate scapegoat, as Jesus Christ himself, is, dare I say it, gloriously over the top and deliciously camp.
He has that look up to heaven, look, you see in all religious paintings representing Christ on the cross. The monster is repeatedly crucified. I mean, he's tied to crosses, he's lifted up. He has, scenes in graveyards where he's framed next to saints.
Wales science fiction has at its heart a very familiar story. An outsider is tortured for being different. A lovable freak is strung up for being weird. It's very British. We still have the mob mentality today. We still scare easily. Anyone who's ever grown up in a village knows the dangers of walking around in a fancy shirt. James Whale created the Frankenstein monster we all know and love. But the original story of Frankenstein was written nearly 100 years earlier by a crinoline-clad sexual renegade called Mary Shelley. Single mom Mary wrote the story of Frankenstein for the entertainment of these two bad boys of the 19th century romantic poetry scene.
Lord Byron.
Byron buggers his missus and sleeps with his sister, allegedly. Shelley, love rat, leaves his wife to shack up with 16-year-old stunner, Mary.
Shelley had abandoned his own wife, Harriet, for the 16-year-old Mary Shelley, and they had fled to Italy together with their illegitimate son, William. Byron himself had left England in complete scandal. He had left his wife and his child after having a rumoured affair with his half-sister, Augusta.
Mary Shelley's monster is a sexy beast. In fact, if you look at the book with a dirty enough mind, it's all about sex.
In many ways, Frankenstein is a very sexually metaphoric text.
It's coming up!
Man uses his scientific tools to penetrate the secrets of nature, almost ravage her in a way. But the results create something unnatural, which has lusts and desires.
Science fiction seems to have a thing about scientists and doctors. Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Strangelove, Doctor Who. They can be heroes or they can be villains, or sometimes they can be both. It all depends on whether the knowledge they're seeking will lead to good or to evil. When Mary Shelley was writing, science wasn't up to much. If you had to go in for an operation, you'd have to sit there without anaesthetic while they sawed your leg off. Blood transfusions would involve little more than being hooked up to a sheep. And to a woman, the prospect of giving birth under these conditions was positively terrifying.
Childbirth seemed to involve somebody dying, either the mother or the child. And there may well have been a sense that Frankenstein's method of bringing children into the world would be safer.
Her own mother had died in childbirth, and Mary herself was to experience the horror of giving birth to a dead baby.
And Frankenstein is an amazing novel. It comes out of a lot of genuine human tragedy, that Mary Shelley miscarried several times, and the whole idea of this man being able to create life from lifelessness is one that was, especially close emotionally to Mary Shelley. And in fact, she writes in some of her journals about dreaming that her little baby, her little dead baby, was roused when she sort of rubbed it by putting it by the fire. She dreamt that her little baby woke up and came to life again.
The Frankenstein story has persisted because scientists are still messing around with our bodies. Of course, it's not that dangerous to give birth now, but what we're really worried about is messing around with the genes of our babies. In science fiction, mad scientists are always trying to create a super race, the perfect human form. But these days, you don't need a mad scientist to create a Superman. You can do it yourself. Unfortunately, the closest I get to turning myself into a master race is when I jog to the fridge. These days, we're well into self-improvement. And ever since Frankenstein, science fiction has been obsessed with how technology can enhance what nature has given us. The $6 Million Man is a direct descendant of Frankenstein's monster. In fact, all cyborgs and androids owe something to that big beast.
Steve Austin, astronaut. A man barely alive.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man.
I suppose Frankenstein, in a way, was about sort of, you know, tampering with nature. It's about sort of pushing God aside and saying, well, actually, you know, we know a bit better, you know, in a kind of secular society. What God provided you is no longer entirely relevant, and if science can do better, then why not give it a shot?
Frankenstein's monster still walks the streets. You see him in the papers every day. This is his pet, a mouse with a human ear grafted onto its back, which is perfectly happy as long as you don't shout at it. And soon he will be giving birth himself to a generation of genetically modified, cloned brats.
Go! You live! Go!
Between them, Mary Shelley and James Whale created the original British science fiction story. It has obsessed us for nearly 200 years because it was such a terrifying and accurate prediction of the future.
I think if Professor Frankenstein had access to the full human genome, he'd have made somebody, you know, who looked more like Clark Gable than Boris Karloff.
After the success of James Whale's Frankenstein, everybody had to go at reanimating him. But when he fell into the clutches of British pulp factory Hammer, he ended up in films like Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, where he was just another run-of-the-mill, common-or-garden bogeyman.
In Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, the Baron, as played by Peter Cushing, blackmails a young couple into assisting him in an experiment to rescue an insane genius from a lunatic asylum to preserve the knowledge in his brain. Needless to say, it all goes horribly wrong.
When I was little, they used to show those double bills, and I just couldn't wait to get through the black and white one to get to the Hammer, and I feel totally the other way now.
In contrast to Hammer, what was radical about James Whale's film was that it dared to make the monster sympathetic. We can all feel the monster's pain. That's why it's aged so well.
People seem to be constantly surprised by the fact they identify with the monster. And you probably believe in pre-publicity for that film and subsequent films in that style, where you see the Frankenstein monster large on the poster, tearing people's heads off. But most of those great characters, even Dracula, have a tragedy at their centre, which makes them very sympathetic. And you can't get more of a victim than a creature who has been brought back to life against his will.
Next week, Big Brother goes porno in the year of the Sex Olympics.